Okay, Dr. Castro is the founding director of the Academic Center for Biomedical and Health Humanities, HealthHum, which aims to center humanity and health and medicine. She's also an instigator for Responsible AI at ICT, RAI, a working group at Wichita State University that brings together researchers from all disciplines to collaborate in intelligently shaping our future in this AI era through translational research that takes special care in how AI is developed and integrated into our world. Her current research foci are philosophy of biomedical engineering and AI ethics, with a heavy dose of humanizing from world philosophy and philosophical counseling. So it's my great pleasure to hand the mic over to you, Susan. Let's hear what you have to say to us.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks to EPA for giving me the opportunity to speak at the annual meeting. Thanks to everyone for being here. Part of the reason I want to give this talk and get some help from EPA members today is that I'm very interested in organizational consulting, which I think is very badly needed in the tech sector and pretty much everywhere else. And so, as Rick said, I'm coming to this from a perspective of an instigator for Responsible AI group. I teach the required ethics course for the computing majors at my university. And so this is really personal to me. In the beginning, I think the argument I'm making today is going to be useful to professionals, both philosophers and tech developers. Part of the background here is that tech companies are actually hiring philosophers now because there is a widespread recognition that we somehow need them in the loop. And that recognition of need is itself in need of some philosophical work, some philosophical midwifery, you might say. The problem, as I see it, is that lack of clarity and insight as to what philosophers do and how they can help is making it hard for companies that recognize a philosophical need to justify the budgets, write the job descriptions, and place philosophers well with the right access and authority and workflow to do the job we need them to do. So the argument I'm making itself is myotic today. I want to draw out more specifically what it is a philosopher can do for a tech company with AI in mind. And then in the philosophy-facing argument, which I'll use for most of the talk, how this can be interesting and useful to philosophers. Okay, so slide. I want to begin with the argument on this slide, which is structured as a pitch for a tech sector audience. It begins with an imperative, in this case, an ethical imperative from the Association of Computing Machinery, ACM 3.7, recognize and take special care of systems that become integrated into society. Artificial intelligence is a class of potentially world-breaking systems that are rapidly becoming thoroughly integrated into the infrastructure of society, and we are certainly not taking special care. So there's a big problem to solve. Moving on to the number 2 on this, the how-to on the slide. In a college ethics course for computing pre-professionals, many of whom already have internships or jobs in computing, their immediate question that follows from nearly any ethical principle is how? What does taking special care look like in practice? How do I do that? So to begin to address that how question, we can draw on philosophy of technology and design theories. Here, I'm using basic concepts of scripts, affordances, and path dependence from philosophy of technology, or equally STS studies, along with value-sensitive design as part of the how-to framework. And as I'll explain more in more detail later, one of the strengths of VSD is that developers begin from a presumption of ignorance as to what the values are and how they should be integrated into the design process and the resulting product. Values must be found by engaging with real people in a tripartite investigation, an iterative process of intertwined conceptual, empirical, and technological investigation. And the conceptual investigation component of VSD is specifically philosophical, I argue, in part because it requires conceptual engineering rather than merely an empirical investigation of the values that stakeholders currently hold. So in practice, VSD without philosophers tends to be conceptually shallow and I think quite myopic because social science methods are designed for a different kind of work. Finally, to motivate why we specifically need philosophical practitioners on the team, not just philosophers, I want to appeal to the Kantian idea that conceptual investigation in VSD and in philosophical practice is first-person plural, impure a priori research. That's 2C on the slide. And if all this adds up, we should find that philosophical practice is a missing link for how to do well in the given context. So pragmatically, the argument on this slide is a form of argument that could be tailored to make a pitch for hiring philosophical practitioners in various roles outside the academy. Since the conclusion is quite overdetermined, I think, the imperative, the how-to, and specifically the philosophical practice considerations can be tailored closely to the audience and context, potentially through the very same first-person plural impure a priori investigations that philosophers practice. For example, value-sensitive design and Kantian epistemology are one way to frame the philosophical work of living up to ATM 3.7. But we could just as easily begin from a NIST principle instead of ACM and draw from universal design or the stride threat model with an Aristotelian epistemology or Lou Marinov's peace method. Given that the tech sector is fully global, the interchangeability of considerations is a maieutic strength of the argument form, even if it's a weakness of this instance. And I need to disclose that I'm drawing from Kant because that's my wheelhouse, not because I think his epistemology is superior or widely shared. I actually don't recommend that anyone try this on a CTO who hasn't already studied Kant. All right, so next slide. Now that you know why I'm giving this talk, the argument on the slide is, I hope, a more philosophically interesting version of the argument for employing philosophical counseling practices in VSD workflows. For accessibility purposes and so on, so we're on the same page, I'm just going to read this slide, and then for the rest of the talk, I'll drill down on the parts of the argument. So this paper sketches the following argument. 1, philosophical counseling, or PC, is a first-person plural form of philosophical research, investigation by us that enlightens us. Conceptual analysis, synthesis, development, that is, conceptual investigation, is central to the processes of PC, whether the particular practice employs formal methods like logic-based therapy or informal approaches. In many cases, this is 2, people seek PC because they want to wisely apply the a priori to their lives. From a Kantian perspective, this would make the typical conceptual investigations of PC impure a priori. 3, value-sensitive design is a framework for helping technology developers design for good. In BSD, conceptual investigation is iteratively intertwined with empirical and technological investigation in order to foreground the values of stakeholders and thoughtfully integrate those values into the scripts and affordances of the design. Whereas the empirical and technological investigations of VSD rely on the empirical methods of social science research and engineering, respectively, the conceptual investigations with which they are intertwined is, I argue, a first-person plural, impure, a priori, conceptual investigation. 4, understanding both PC and VSD in this way yields at least 2 significant results, so I hope. A, philosophical counseling or philosophical practice more generally is ideally suited to the work of conceptual investigation in VSD. And B, this way of understanding humanities research offers insight into a much-needed alternative to the traditional extractive methods of human subjects research that historically led to the necessity of IRB protections. Since this last point wasn't covered in the tech-facing argument, I'll take a quick moment to motivate it now. I want to emphasize from the first premise on the slide that philosophical counseling and philosophical practice more generally is a form of research. It's a form of research that engages with human subjects. And given past atrocities in research on human subjects, there are very good reasons for requiring IRB approval before engaging in research with humans. That said, the risks of philosophical counseling and conceptual engineering are quite different from the risks of experimenting on people, or of using people as data sources, or of extracting knowledge from observing people. Methods in community-engaged research, participatory research, and indigenous research are evolving from third-party intervention and observation of subjects towards first-person plural co-designed research that is by, for, and about the human subjects involved in the investigation. So in the social sciences, elevating qualitative research, especially through grounded theory, is a step in the right direction, but I will argue that it doesn't go far enough. Okay, so this is the philosophy-facing argument, so one that's really more for you guys who are interested in philosophy. The first premise of the philosophy-facing argument is that philosophical counseling is a first-person plural form of philosophical research, an investigation by us that enlightens us. In the simplest case of individual philosophical counseling, a client wants to talk to a philosopher one-on-one. The client sets the imperative. Their reasons and aims drive the dialogue. The philosopher brings a knowledge and skill base to the dialogue that they use together as means to the client's ends. The how-to of philosophical practice may take many forms, some of which have been articulated and developed for decades or even thousands of years. And for most of these approaches, in order to ask good questions and engage in a dialogue that's actually helpful to the client, the philosophical counselor must, at least to some extent, take on the client's perspective, enter their worldview, share their aims and interests, and attune to their affect. Client and philosopher are on the same journey. They are a first-person plural, we, rather than merely a second-person I, you, or a third-person I, they. The client is in the primary position of power to, metaphorically, determine whether they're just wandering, exploring, or trying to get home, as well as when the journey is done. The philosopher is a navigator who knows the terrain, how to forage when they're lost, and where the wild things are. So overall, philosophical counseling relationships are personal and symmetric in comparison to the impersonal asymmetric relationships between science researchers and their subjects. Scientists, including social scientists, are trying to empirically determine what is. And this is traditionally interpreted to mean that scientists ought to maintain an othering objective distance from their subjects so as not to contaminate the experiment or bias the results. The scientist must remove herself as completely as possible from the object of study. So this relationship tends to be objectifying, sometimes even lacking in compassion and humanity. In Western institutions of science like those in the US, the scientist is held responsible for hypothesis generation, experimental design, experiment implementation, and results, which traditionally leaves no room for the subject to contribute or co-design the research. Thus, the traditional conception of scientific responsibility entails fundamental asymmetries in power and epistemic authority between the scientist and subject. And also, since research on human subjects has historically seldom benefited directly those research subjects, these aspects of how science is conceived tend to make human subjects systematically vulnerable to exploitation. Thus, we need institutions like IRBs to protect humans and animal subjects. Now, quantitative social science research in fields like sociology and cultural anthropology have been modeled closely on research methods in biology, chemistry, and other sciences that traditionally work from this framework, sometimes leading to sharp ethical critiques of social science research methods. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is a rough analog of empirically engaged philosophical research. In grounded theory, for example, the scientist constructs a survey or interview scheme, typically with very open questions intended to elicit the subject's own words and thoughts. What the subjects say is the data, which is then analyzed for themes, concepts, scope, and overlap between participants. Qualitative social scientists are still required to scrupulously avoid biasing the results by contaminating the subject's answers. And this is perhaps even more acute for qualitative researchers because their methods have also historically been criticized as subjective, thus not scientific. They're still specifically attempting to find what is, for example, what are the organizing concepts of this culture. And the research agenda and design are still researcher-driven. Now, given the contentions that social sciences are exploitative, paternalistic, imperialistic, or otherwise immoral, there has recently been a global movement towards community-engaged research, participatory research, and indigenous research paradigms that shift autonomy and control from the scientist to human subjects. The basic idea is that scientists should not first develop the research agenda and then apply it to a population. Instead, they should first engage with the community as one would with a client to identify the imperatives, methods, and what qualifies as a successful research outcome. So community-engaged qualitative social science research should now look pretty similar to philosophical practice. Now, philosophical practice can, in some cases, be limited to helping clients figure out what they do, think, or feel or want. And it is certainly possible for philosophical practitioners to overstep by imposing their own conceptual frameworks and agendas on clients. But philosophical practice often aims to help people philosophically grow, develop, and construct new ways of life. The client often seeks philosophical practice because they want to change what they do think, what they do feel, what they do want, or how they do live. And this is a different research telos, a telos that entails philosophical means. Thus, rather than contaminating the client's worldview with new ideas, the reflective, interrogative sharing of ideas in philosophical practice, some of which come from the philosopher, can be both a means for growth and an end in itself for both participants. And sometimes philosophical growth takes the form of reconstructing our values or way of life in light of rapid technological change, like AI. So, in addition to the teleological difference between community-engaged qualitative social science research and philosophical practice, there's also a difference in how we understand research outcomes or results. To get at this, I'm showing on the slide a quote from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services website. This website page defines some scholarly and journalistic activities as not research for IRB purposes. Thus, they're exempt from the IRB approval process. Research, it says, is a systematic investigation that aims to contribute to generalizable knowledge. In contrast, it says, journalism, legal research, and historical research are not research in the relevant sense because they focus directly on specific individuals. In other words, if you're sampling from people in order to make generalizations about people, you're doing research that requires IRB approval. If what you're doing is instead particular or personal, it's not research for IRB purposes. Okay, so philosophical practice generally does not sample people for generalizations. That's not what it's about. Philosophical counseling is particular and individual, whereas group facilitation and organizational consulting are still particular, even though that first person plural, we, is a larger plural. And as I indicated earlier, the telos of philosophical practice is typically something more than, or at least different from, empirical knowledge discovery. The aim is often constructive, to philosophically engineer something new. Or as Kant might say, the aim is ampliative, synthetic cognition. Okay, so now I think we're ready for the Kant part. As I said in the tech-facing argument, other epistemologies or views of philosophical practice can be substituted here. And if you can't stand Kant, feel free to tune out for a bit. Very quickly, Kant's big agenda in the critique of pure reason is to determine the bounds of possible experience, in part by explaining how synthetic a priori cognition of objects is possible. Unpacking this a bit, cognition here is framed through the logical forms of judgment, where judgments have a subject-predicate form. When a cognition is analytic, the predicate is conceptually contained in the subject, so analysis of the subject yields the predicate. When a cognition is synthetic, it's ampliative, because the subject-predicate relationship is synthesized through their containment in a third thing. For example, contingent empirical knowledge is synthetic a posteriori. Experience or observation is the third thing. Most of Kant's attention in the critiques is devoted to pure a priori cognition, in which nothing empirical is mixed. In contrast, natural philosophy is impure a priori, and so is philosophical practice. And I do want to emphasize, I make general claims about philosophical practice, not universal exceptionalist claims. Nearly all the time, I think, clients are seeking practical insight into matters that Kant would classify as a priori, like the nature of reality, how we ought to live, or the underlying logic of their thoughts and worldview. The practical insight aspects of philosophical practice entails application to lived experience, which is at least in part driven by the contingencies of personal history and circumstance. In Kantian epistemology, this is the space of impure a priori cognition. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. I'm not going to read the slide. I do think Kant has something interesting to say about the first person plural. And for this, I appeal to his theory of imagination. I think his theory of imagination in the anthropology has resources for how to understand that first person plural as a synthesis of persons in imagination. And I think this idea or some other analog from the literature will be needed to shape what philosophical practice will look like for the first person plural ballpark of group facilitation and organizational consulting in BSD. We need some way to understand how to scale up without generalizing. So the imaginative Kantian we is one way to do that. We can come back to this if people are interested. All right, so why do we care about any of this? Maybe what Kant would say is intrinsically interesting to some people. But I've been trying to argue that this idea of first-person plural impure a priori research in philosophical practice is useful in tech. So I want to emphasize 2 points. The first point here is that the empirical can mask the a priori in impure contexts, thus mask the essentially philosophical nature of a priori work concerning value, purpose, and meaning. This is in part due to the fact that empirical methods are often the only methods that professionals learn in business and engineering programs. So the concept of impure a priori research is important, regardless of the language we choose to use and the paradigms of applied philosophy we might have in mind. But this only gets us to an imperative to hire philosophers. So the second point is that the particular kind of impure a priori research is first-person plural research with human subjects. The individualistic armchair philosophy that still dominates academic philosophy can be just as imperialistic and exploitative as traditional social science methods. What we need for BSD is not merely conceptual investigation, but philosophical engineering from philosophical practitioners. So let's turn to value-sensitive design. The first point I want to make about BSD is that its value investigations have a generally Bayesian structure that are basically a proxy for the kinds of Socratic inquiry used in philosophical practice. As I mentioned earlier, it's a strength of VSD that the investigation begins from an assumption of ignorance. We don't know what matters to stakeholders or how values should be designed into the product. And in a standard Bayesian scheme, we may assume arbitrary start values as our first prior, and then in each iteration, we update the prior until convergence on the actual value. Given that start values can prime human subjects, however, thus skewing results via a local effect, how to initiate the investigation is an important issue in BSD. And philosophers who approach this from outside the philosophical practitioner viewpoint, for example, Jacobson and Hultgren quoted here, they're likely to begin from an ethical theory, kind of like the students in A.V. Goutham's study, whereas a trained philosophical practitioner has a better chance, I think, of midwifing patient participants' actual ethos for critical reflection without starting from a theory that might bias the outcomes. And now, also, given that iteration need not converge on stable core values, how to iterate productively without investigator bias is also an issue. And philosophical practice might not have all the answers here, but philosophers have been practicing and developing Socratic methods for thousands of years, whereas Bayesian iteration and BSD are comparatively undeveloped and untested. And since designing for good can require rather fine balancing of values, and we've seen this very clearly with the fair AI attempts, it stands to reason that perhaps philosophical practitioners might offer some methodological and content advantages. Okay. So second, and this is the last one, I want to more explicitly identify where philosophers and philosophical practitioners are needed. Okay, so looking at the first bullet on the slide, there seems to be little need to argue that engineers and designers ought to be on tech development teams. For example, in AI development, people in the engineering and designer roles focus on parameters and system values like lag time or latency between prompt and result, interoperability of the model through API calls, algorithmic drift within a context window, or overall model drift over time, prompt injection and cybersecurity issues, and so on. Looking at the second bullet, social scientists are trained to investigate the values that stakeholder groups currently hold. They're good at that. And so far, there's no evident need for philosophers, or more specifically, for philosophical practitioners. But as Lauren Valorenkamp say here in the quote, conceptual engineering may, for example, entail analytically explicating several conceptions to specify what stakeholders might have in mind with a certain value term. In other words, we need to understand what stakeholders mean by the words they use. So this is a common element of philosophical practice that philosophical practitioners are good at. And they go on to say, part of this analysis is also to assess whether stakeholder values are truly valuable in this context. And as I've been arguing, this is clearly impure a priori, lying outside the expertise of engineers and social scientists. I also think the last 4 bullets on the slide involve philosophical work. So a values assessment of a given design includes determining which values are entrenched, variable, or absent from a design. Some of this work is straightforward. Cybersecurity values, well, safety and security. Interoperability improves convenience and increases function. But some of this work is more philosophical and more challenging. For example, there are scripts by which we verify user identity and permit access to systems. Each script encodes values. For example, a username and password script prioritizes the ability to type and remember, whereas multi-factor authentication prioritizes a known digital identity. And biometrics prioritize normalized adult biology that changes little over time. What we value and what we don't is embedded into the choice of script. And this is at least one philosophical step deep, and those values are at least one philosophical step deeper than identifying order of priority. The affordances of a design are what it offers, provides, or furnishes to the user. So identity verification scripts afford access. Or to put it another way, the affordance is the what, whereas the script is the how. In an AI context, a given product like Claude or ChatGPT may afford users the option to disallow training. Or it may afford users a dashboard to estimate the environmental impact of their AI use. It may afford users features like slash commands, projects, and skills. Some of these scripts and affordances may have a lock-in effect, either intentionally or unintentionally, that generates dependence on a path that's hard to escape after it becomes suboptimal. For example, if users must invest heavily in their time and effort to configure and personalize, and there's no affordance to save that work outside the platform or port it to a different platform, or if AI is embedded into critical workflows, discontinuing use will be very expensive. My point here is that specific expertise is required to assess the values designed into a product, and philosophical work is required to engineer better values into a design. Finally, the last 2 bullets reflect aspects of tech development that I think require philosophical expertise intertwined with social science and engineering expertise. User experience, for example, is often considered the province of designers, but their work relies on constraints set by engineering feasibility and stakeholder priorities. I would argue as well that improving user experience requires philosophical work to align design with long-term value engineering and to teleologically align development with broader human aims. Without philosophers at the table, dev teams tend to take too much as given. For example, the claim that artificial general intelligence is a good that ought to be developed. And this is not to say that AI developers are universally uncritical or myopic. Many AI developers have pushed back, petitioned, written scathing critiques, and quit their jobs. Some were even trained as philosophers before transitioning into tech careers. But most devs are so overwhelmed with moment-to-moment demands that they cannot be expected to do the reflective philosophical work that isn't in their job description and which is typically well beyond their training. We need to seriously ask the question whether it is even possible to design AI for good, and which kinds. It isn't a foregone conclusion that artificial general intelligence is a good idea, much less artificial superintelligence. And yet, those are explicit goals of the tech industry. Okay. So, wrapping up, I've argued that philosophical counseling is a distinctive first-person plural, impure a priori form of philosophical research that we need for the conceptual investigation thread of value-sensitive design, especially in the era of AI. You can tell me now in the Q&A how well I did at this. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to take questions, comments, and devastating objections. And here's some references.
Excellent. Very interesting. Very quick.
It's high level overview there.
But yes, and I think you will share your slides with us, and hopefully you'll write this up for us too.
I do too.
Awesome. All right, so floor is open. Lou, you raised your hand first, so let's go to you first.
Sure, hopefully not last. This is very interesting, Susan. Thank you. And I just want to add something that was between a lot of the lines, but for our philosophical community, not necessarily explicit, but you let me know if it's on point. What you've given us on the philosophy side, particularly those who are analytically trained, I would think, from your context, is some very valuable guidelines about how to prepare a pitch. What philosophers are never trained for in the current climate is how to navigate organizational cultures. Those of us who do so had to learn the hard way by making mistakes and eventually correcting ourselves and getting some guidance. But those guys were few and far between in the early days. So my point is, just in general to the audience, that you've done a great job of explaining to us in our own terms what we need to do. The flip side of it, from my perspective, would seem to be for philosophers to really be mindful that no CTO is going to understand a word of what you've just said to us. So if you go in with slides like this to pitch yourself, you're not going to get in the door, okay? So what you need to think about on the corporate side is their absolute lack of reflective training. And as you well said at the end, we're all compelled to multitask. Nobody has time anymore, not even us. So my point is that on the banner point is the corporate world, the government ministries, the public servants, the private sector. If you're working with a group of high energy, high end, high earning, high value executive types, they need a takeaway. The company will not give them time unless they know in advance that they're going to get a takeaway. We have a lot of room, right, between the lines. The takeaway can't be a Chinese fortune cookie platitude, and it can't be Kant's critique of pure reason. The takeaway has to be something useful and comprehensible to them. And we have, fortunately, a plethora, well, not a plethora, but we have several robust methodologies that have been used by applied ethicists and others, which we teach occasionally, but which are available to us as ways of getting in the door to give them something that's tempting and that also signals they'll get a takeaway. So is that more or less on point with with what you've been telling us from the philosophy side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I would like to advocate for is that most tech companies that already recognize they need philosophers don't know how to use them. So hiring an organizational consultant to figure out what the job description should be is the first step before you actually hire the philosophical consultant. And that's something that needs to be figured out in any application. It's not something that you can know in advance what they will need. You don't know their organization yet. You're an outsider. So that's something that I think we need to figure out how to get our foot in the door a little bit better. But there is huge demand for humanities from industry right now. And we need to make a better pitch for what the philosophical contribution to that be. I absolutely do not recommend that you use my slides or anything like this. I think the part that's useful is what's the imperative and what's the how-to. Make sure that the how-to has a part that they understand, and then the philosophical part in a much simpler version. So not the, impure, epirate, first person plural, not that, but simple language that will help them understand what it is the philosopher can do that a social scientist or a designer or an engineer isn't going to be as good at. And so I would say, think about the long-term goals of the company. What's the longevity of this project? Think about the scope of the mission. So a lot of the time companies have mission creep. They start with one thing and then they try to expand it to lots of other things. How should the mission creep be managed? Philosophers are good at that. So I do think that the structure is one that we need, but the particular version I gave was for you, not for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely concur with you. And don't, by any means, don't leave this to human resources to word that when they look in the heart. If you leave it to them, they'll have the least clue of all of what they're trying to hire. So you're absolutely right. I mean, my sense is that exactly the same, that there's an increasing demand. The pushback against the technocracy has been successful to the extent that many people who are moderately well educated realize the need for humanities and therefore for philosophy. So we have an opportunity. There are doors that are opening more than a crack, but we need to be proactive in preparing a client side prospectus that they can understand and from which they can be assured they'll get some kind of concrete takeaway. There's a disconnect there. We do philosophy because we love philosophy. They won't do philosophy because they love it. They'll do it because it gives them something concrete at the end of the day they can apply to their particular problem. So this is where we have to make that leap. And again, analytically trained philosophers are not trained to make that leap, but practitioners are, more or less. So thank you very much for this really clear, from our side, idea of how to design value into such proposals.
I want to add just one little thing before we go to Gabriel, whose next hand is up, just embellishing on what Lou said. But your explanation in ordinary language in the last few minutes that's the range of language that I think the people on the tech side need to hear. These are the things that philosophical counselors or philosophical chief philosophy officers, whatever you want to call them, right? Because some companies have chief philosophy officers already. So these are the things that they can do. And that paper, that's another paper you could write. Like what you just presented is a very theoretically rich paper, kind of justifying and mapping things out for technical knowledge on the philosophical side, situating it with Kant, all that sort of thing. I want to say one more little, not big picture point that's important. But yeah, the ordinary English one will help the philosophers. Leave Kant out of it. I remember Kant. I have oh my God, I don't want to hear about Kant anymore. I took 2 classes on Kant in grad school. That was enough Kant for me. But one little thing you said about the we space or, the first person plural, that a third thing emerges. Pay attention to the next presentation because I think it's very relevant to that point by Shanti and Andrew. All right, Gabriel.
Thank you, Susan. That was great. I wonder if you can say anything more about what we've described now as this sense of this increasing demand. I have it too. I think it's really interesting. You notice it in headlines. You notice it in different people, positions, and you're like, oh, they have a philosophy degree. What about that? But I wonder if there's any, if there's any sort of numbers, studies, any other way to actually gauge this demand beyond kind of anecdotally.
Yeah, that's actually really hard. So the things that I've been seeing, many of them have noted how secretive companies are about how many philosophers they have on the payroll and what they're doing. And there is a suspicion that people are hiring philosophers because it makes them look more ethical, but they're not actually doing anything. They have no power authority. They're not influencing anything for the better. They're just rolling along, doing our bad things.
Not right now, thank
So
you.
getting numbers is really hard. And I would hope that over time we'd be a little more transparent about this. But I mean, these are private companies and they don't have to disclose stuff. Once they become public companies, we might have a little more leverage, but probably not.
Anybody else? Andrew? Andrew had a hand up.
Yeah, sorry. Just a very brief thing. There was a piece in The Economist just a couple of days ago, why big AI labs are hiring so many philosophers. And it was a really interesting piece. You might just want to search it out. Talking about AI firms hiring ethicists and trying to come up with company policies, actually using Kant and deontology and some kind of consequentialist stuff. But it's worth a little read.
Yeah, I mean, it's primarily primarily they're hiring philosophers as ethicists. They're also firing them whenever they say things they don't like. So Timnit Gebr is a perfect example of what happens when you push back too hard. But they're not really hiring the philosophers to do the conceptual work. And so that's one of the things that I was trying to emphasize in this paper, is that it's not just about the values. It's about conceptual engineering more generally, and it's not just about ethical values. It's about values full stop. And so thinking about this as a matter of ethics, and we can apply, utilitarianism or deontology or Confucian ethics, I think makes it a lot shallower than it could be. And so I would really hope that, as we think about what philosophers can actually do as either chief philosophy officers or in lower level positions, we should try to keep the metaphysics and epistemology also in mind, and the sort of meta-ethics or metaphysical axiology, you might say.
Lou has his hand up, and we have only 2 minutes left. So Lou, let's let
Well,
you end this session.
Just a caveat to, it's not an end of anything but a beginning, Rick, and a caveat to what Andrew and Susan have just mentioned, that, and I don't want to be a cynic about this, but I have to be cynical about this, because we are chasing the leading edge of technology always. We're reactive. We can't be proactive, because the real AI is in the hands of government and military, not in the hands of industry. Industry is subcontracted by defense, but it's being weaponized both for military purposes and for big data. It's not Big Brother anymore. It's big data are watching. So we don't have no input into that. And what's happening, as I see it, is it's academic philosophers are smart. We've always been smart. And we're reverse engineering this to create a whole industry called AI ethics. Which gives us more leverage inside the academy and very little outside of it. All right. So I mean, just if you really want to be proactive, then you have to beat the doors down and get hired by a corporation. But as you said, they're hiring and firing. Why? Because there's always a corporate script, which they're not going to show you when you apply or get interviewed. But there's a corporate script, and as soon as you say something that doesn't jive with the corporate script, you're out. So we have to compromise ourselves, even to be an ethicist in the AI industry. There's some meta ethical compromise that may have to be made. Okay, I'm just saying that as a cautionary tale, but there is huge opportunity at the same time. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.